The no-dig garden was one of the 4 family-scale gardens that I established when I first started this Red Gardens project all those years ago. It has been the garden that I've had the highest hopes for and probably been most disappointed by until recently. This no-dig garden is now doing quite well, producing lots of high-quality vegetables, but it took more time to become really established than I had thought, for a few reasons. I think the potential benefits of a no-dig approach like this can be really interesting and could lead to better crops and bigger harvests. And I wonder why it hasn't started to produce significantly better than the other gardens yet. I first established this no-dig garden using the Lasagne method of covering the undisturbed ground with undecomposed organic matter, a method I'd learned about through the permaculture movement. But I didn't really do it very well, mainly because of a lack of resources and time, and I didn't really know what I was doing back then. I continued with that method for quite a few years, and noticed that there was a few key issues that made the method less successful in this temperate maritime climate. The layer of decomposing organic material became an excellent breeding ground for slugs, one of our main pests, and the covering kept the soil underneath cool, which seemed to delay the growth in the spring. 5 years ago, I decided to switch to a no-dig method that I'd learned about from Charles Dowding, which was apparently much more appropriate for a cooler climate and involved mulching with compost or organic matter that had already been decomposed. Because the area of the garden had already been established with the vegetation removed, I decided to use less compost than is usually recommended to start with. Looking back, I think it would have been better to have started with a lot more compost, if I had been able to get it. I only had a limited amount of my own compost available for this garden, and for the first year I supplemented it with horse manure and bedding that we hauled in from a local farm. Together this added up to almost 3 cubic meters of compost, which spread over the 4 large beds of this 100 square meter garden produced a layer of compost only 3 centimeters deep, or just over 1 inch. This is significantly less than what is usually recommended for the first year of establishing a garden like this. But it is close to what is recommended as an annual top-up layer of compost, so I thought that this would be fine, as the space was already established. The garden grew reasonably well for that first year after switching to a new method, but not necessarily better than it had in the past or in comparison to the other gardens. The following year, I decided to finally start buying in municipal compost, as I wasn't able to make enough compost myself, and I needed an easier option to get a lot more compost for the increasing amount of growing spaces in this project. That year, I spread over 4 cubic meters, or about 44 wheelbarrow loads of this clean and easy to manage compost onto the large beds of this garden, producing a layer of 5 centimeters or 2 inches deep. And for each of the next 3 years, I added an additional 2 to 3 cubic meters of the same municipal compost, adding another layer over the old layers of compost on the same beds. So I have brought in a total of about 15 cubic meters of compost in 5 years for this one garden, with the 12 large bags that I bought in the last 4 years costing €900, which is a fairly big investment, especially compared to some of the other gardens. So over the last 5 years, we have added layers of compost that add up to about 17.5 centimeters or 7 inches. But of course, the level of the top of the beds of this garden are only marginally above the surrounding soil. There was some compaction, of course, but all the compost that we have added has further decomposed, reducing in volume, and a lot of the carbon within the material would have been consumed by soil organisms and released into the atmosphere as CO2 gas. Some of the nitrogen that was in the original compost would have been lost to the air through common biological processes, and some of it probably leached into the groundwater. Hopefully, a lot of the nitrogen stayed in the soil, along with a lot of the other nutrients, which is what the plants are looking for, and a fair amount of the carbon is still there, which has significantly darkened the topsoil. When I dig test holes in the soil of this garden, there is a gradual transition from darker to lighter, which is what happens in a lot of natural ecosystems, but it's not really visible in the soil that I regularly dig. I recently took soil samples for testing from all of the gardens before adding any of the compost or fertility for this growing season. And after drying the samples, the soil in the no-dig garden is noticeably darker than the other gardens. This is because there is a lot more carbon or organic matter in the top layers of the soil of this garden, which is what I would have expected with all the compost that we've added and that we've never dug it. This is essentially the remains of the compost that has been added over the years. Some of it near the surface seems to still be decomposing, and the worms and other soil organisms have brought a lot of it deeper into the soil and transformed it into a diversity of soil organic matter. It is fascinating to see this happen over just a few years, and it is definitely a sign that the topsoil is improving in this garden, possibly becoming better than the soil in the other gardens. This should increase the nutrient and water holding capacity of the soil and provide a lot more food for a wide diversity of soil biology, which remains largely undisturbed. All of which should help make more nutrients available to the plants, either from the compost that we added or from the soil itself. And in theory, this should help make this garden more resilient and productive, though I'm not sure I'm seeing that yet. I think the municipal compost we have been using is part of the issue, as it still has a fair amount of decomposing to do when we add it to the surface of the garden beds. And because it was made with a lot of woody material, there is still quite a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, with a lot of the nitrogen essentially locked up or unavailable to the plants, at least until there is further decomposition. I confirmed this with the potato grow bag trials last year, where the plants growing in this type of compost didn't produce well unless regularly fed with something high in soluble nitrogen while they were growing. And the compost didn't seem to be releasing enough nutrients for the potato plants until later in the season, possibly because of the warmth of the summer speeding up the decomposition process. I realize now that a relatively thin layer of compost sitting on the surface of the soil is not going to be decomposing very quickly, but a new layer will be covering the remains of the compost from the year before, and what remains of the even older compost underneath that. I suspect that a lot of the nutrients taken up by the plants last year was brought into the garden in the compost that we added several years before that, which had finally decomposed enough to release a lot of the nitrogen and nutrients that it contained. I wonder what would have happened if I had brought in enough compost to cover all of the beds to the recommended depth of 10 to 15 centimeters in the first season of switching to this method. At the time, I was really hesitant to buy in the 10 or 12 large bags that I would have needed to do this, but I now think that it would have sped up this process. A thicker layer of compost would have provided a greater volume for the plants to forage in for the nutrients that they needed. And as the sun and wind can dry out the top part of the compost, with a deeper layer, more of the material would remain moist and protected from the elements enough to continue active decomposition. The other option that has been recommended by other growers would be to use a layer of much better quality compost on top of the soil, with a thicker layer of lower quality compost on top of that. This makes sense to me, as the higher quality compost would be able to release enough nutrients to feed the plants for the first year. The better compost would also potentially bring in a lot more useful biology, which could speed up the whole process of decomposing within the poor quality compost that was covering it. With this method, the lower level will be feeding the plants that year and boosting the biology. The middle layer will be continuing to decompose for feeding the plants in the future, and the top layer will act as a mulch to protect it all, which will be covered in the following year. Because I didn't start with such a thick layer and have only been adding lower quality compost, the potential benefits to the plants and the development of the garden probably took a few extra years. When buying in this compost, I knew that it was not very rich, and added some chicken manure pellets as a concentrated fertility, thinking it would help out a bit, and have added some more over the years, though not very consistently. Looking back, I now realize that it probably wasn't enough to make any significant difference. Between all the amendments and liquid feeding, I calculated that I added a total of about 800 grams of nitrogen over the past 4 years, which translates to a total of about 10 grams per square meter of nitrogen added to the growing beds of this garden over 4 years. I now think that 10 grams per square meter each season would have been better to supplement the poor quality compost, and as some of the nitrogen would have been absorbed and locked up into the compost itself, perhaps even more would have been useful. Essentially, I bought in a lot of carbon that didn't contain enough nitrogen. So I could have bought in additional nitrogen to amend it and to feed the plants until things got established, or waited until the material decomposed or matured enough to a much more useful carbon to nitrogen ratio. The other option, of course, is to get better quality compost, but clean farmyard manure can be difficult to get around here. And in this context, it's probably easier and cheaper to buy in a supply of concentrated nitrogen than it would be to buy in and spread even more of the lower quality compost. I am quite pleased with the crops we've been able to get out of this garden over the past few years, but it is still not as good as I would have thought, at least compared to the other gardens. This is a difficult thing to really compare, as the gardens aren't set up for direct comparison, which would require eliminating a lot of the other variables. But it is possible to compare some crops growing in 3 or 4 of the other gardens, even if the plant spacing and other factors are different. A crop of curly kale in the no-dig garden did about as well as it did in the other gardens, comparing both the yield per area and per plant, and the plants all looked equally healthy across the different gardens. The squash plants produced a lot when measured per square meter, but not a lot from each plant. But the plants in the no-dig garden seemed to die back earlier in the season than in some of the other gardens, which I thought was strange. The courgette plants in the no-dig garden produced a lot more than in the other gardens, and these plants seemed to have what they needed to grow really big and to produce a lot of fruit. The early potato crop wasn't great in comparison to the other gardens, though it was nice to easily pull out the buried potatoes by hand from plants that were earthed up with even more compost. The runner beans were similar to the rest, and any difference in the yield per square meter or per plant is likely due to differences in plant density. And this is probably also the case with the different crops of peas, especially as the peas and beans can use the help of special bacteria to produce extra nitrogen in their root systems. The carrot crop in the no-dig garden was probably the best out of all the gardens, with a bigger crop of roots that were not forked. But this difference was probably more because this was the only garden that we had successfully prevented the carrot root fly from getting into the crop. But it was nice to see that they could grow well in the uncultivated soil. So overall, the no-dig garden did about as well as the other gardens, at least in terms of what I was able to observe and compare, and most of the plants look quite healthy across all the different gardens. Any difference is probably better explained by some other factor, including mistakes that I made as a grower. But I guess I was expecting that the soil in the no-dig garden would produce something noticeably better, and I haven't been able to see that yet. This no-dig method is definitely less work in some ways, especially when not needing to dig the soil, and less time spent weeding, and both of these can be really beneficial in a busy season. So it can definitely be worth starting a garden with a no-dig method like this if you can get and can afford the amount of compost that's needed. And I think it might be better to invest in more compost earlier when starting this garden, and better quality compost or any amendments, rather than adding smaller quantities over the years. But I don't really know that yet, and it will be interesting to see how successful this approach is in the no-till trials that we set up a few months ago. But there are supposed to be other benefits of not disturbing the soil, at least compared to the soil of the other gardens that are regularly dug over. The soil profile looks great, and it looks like there is significantly more organic matter in this topsoil, and a lot of worms and other soil life, which hasn't been disturbed through cultivation. All of this should help lead to increased and more diverse soil biology, as well as better nutrient and water holding capacity of the topsoil. And all of this should help to grow healthier and more resilient plants, which should be able to produce more. Perhaps some crops are doing better, but this could be due to other factors, and the plants in this garden do not seem to be consistently better than the same plants growing in gardens that are regularly dug. There are some other variables involved, and I am planning to regularize the planting plans between a few of these gardens this year for better comparisons. We're also adding supplies of nitrogen as well as seaweed meal below the layer of compost this year, as I think this will help. And it will be interesting to see the nutrient profile when the soil tests come back from the lab, as there could be other imbalances or deficiencies that could be fixed. Perhaps this no-dig benefit might be delayed for some other reason, or it's possible I'm just expecting too much from this garden. But if not digging the soil can be potentially beneficial in so many different ways, I would have thought I would have seen more of a difference between the gardens by now.